the BBC present the true story of the Nigerian Civil War, or did they repeat a version of the historical propaganda that has dominated for more than 50 years? In case you haven't heard about it, I am talking about this documentary, Surviving Biafra: Voices from the Nigerian Civil War, which was released by BBC Africa Eye on the 1st of June this year. The documentary has been praised for bringing attention to one of Africa's deadliest conflicts. But for many Igbo people and former Biafrans, the documentary seems to echo the Nigerian government version of the war. It leaves out crucial facts that explain why and how the war happened in the first place, and presents false narratives about several others. In this video, let's examine BBC Africa Eye's Surviving Biafra documentary from an objective perspective. We'll look at what they got right, the major facts that were omitted or downplayed, and the narratives that were outright lies. I'll also touch on the suspicious coincidence of the documentary coming out on the heels of the publication of General Gowon's autobiography. Before discussing the problems with the documentary, it is important to acknowledge what it got right. The documentary correctly shows the terrible suffering experienced in Biafra during the war. It highlights the effects of the Nigerian government's blockade that led to the starvation that devastated Biafra and resulted in many scholars and countries accusing the Nigerian government of committing war crimes. It also succeeds in reminding us of the enviable position of the Igbo in the early 1960s. Here is a clip from the documentary.
Britain's colonial rulers had left an uneasy coalition of several vast tribal groupings. Most significant were the Muslim houses in the north, the Yorubas in the west, and 14 million Igbos in the eastern region. The Igbos were Christian, they were generally wealthier and better educated than other Nigerians, and they dominated business and the civil service. They also happened to be sitting on Nigeria's vast oil reserves.
The documentary also mentioned the important role that Britain and oil played in the war. These are significant facts that should never be forgotten. But once the documentary moves from human suffering into explaining the causes and costs of the war, serious problems begin to emerge. It flat out began to recount the British and Nigerian government's propaganda. One of the first indications is the way it depicts pre-war Nigeria. The people interviewed gave the impression that Nigeria was largely peaceful until the events of 1966 suddenly pushed the country into crisis.
In 1966, January 15, there was a coup in Nigeria which messed up everything.
This is simply not true. Long before the coup of January 1966, there had already been major ethnic and political tensions across the country. As far back as 1945, there were the Jos riots that resulted in attacks on Igbo people living in northern Nigeria. Then came the Kano riot of May 1953. This time, all Southerners, along with the Igbos living in Kano, became targets of violence. These riots resulted in the deaths of many Southerners and demonstrated that serious divisions existed within the Nigerian state years before the Civil War. By failing to provide this background, the documentary creates the false impression that the conflict emerged suddenly rather than being rooted in decades of unresolved tensions. The most downplayed events in the documentary are the Anti-Igbo Pogroms of 1966. These massacres are arguably the single most important event in understanding why Biafra was declared. Hundreds of thousands of Easterners fled the north and other parts of Nigeria after repeated attacks, while tens of thousands were killed. Entire communities were uprooted. For many Igbo people, the decision to support secession was not driven by politics or ideology, but by fear of extermination. Yet, the documentary moves over these events far too quickly. The scale, brutality, and psychological impact of the pogroms deserved much deeper treatment. Without understanding the pogroms, it is impossible to understand why so many Easterners believed remaining within Nigeria had become impossible. Perhaps the most serious and devious omission in the entire documentary is the Aburi Accord. The meeting held in Aburi, Ghana in January 1967 represented the last real chance for peace. Leaders from all the regions in Nigeria met and reached an agreement that would have prevented war. The Eastern region under Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu stuck to the decision made by all at Aburi. But after returning to Nigeria, General Yakubu Gowon's government refused to implement the signed Aburi agreement. Gowon totally went back on his words. The collapse of Aburi destroyed the final opportunity for a peaceful solution. Had the accord been respected, there would likely have been no civil war. This is one of the most important moments in the entire history of the war. By leaving out Aburi, the documentary removes any attempt to be considered a credible history of the war. Another major issue concerns the documentary's presentation of how the war began. The documentary creates the impression that the Biafran advance into the Midwest was the beginning of the conflict and presents the Nigerian side largely as responding to Biafran actions. This reverses the actual sequence of events. It's on record that the first shots of the war were fired on July 6, 1967, when federal forces launched attacks at Gaken in present-day Cross River State, while at the same time, another division was attacking in the Nsukka area. These operations formed part of what the federal government described as a police action against Biafra. The objective was to invade Biafran territory and swiftly crush the secession. Only much later in the war, the Biafran forces launched their counter-offensive into the Midwest. The documentary either neglectfully or deceitfully presents this counterattack as if it were the opening stage of the war. Basically, they try to push the narrative that Biafrans were the aggressors. Language matters. Throughout the documentary, Biafran forces are frequently described as rebels. This label is deeply problematic. Rebels are people who fight to overthrow a government. Biafrans were fighting to survive after several massacres, displacement, and the collapse of trust in the Nigerian state. They were a people defending their existence. The use of the word rebel automatically places the Nigerian government on the side of legitimacy and Biafra on the side of illegitimacy. That framing is highly controversial and biased. That terminology may reflect the position of the Nigerian government, but it is not a neutral description for a non-partisan documentary, and makes one wonder if the documentary is just another British and Nigerian government propaganda tool. A deeper problem runs throughout the documentary. It relies heavily on the framework that has dominated Nigeria's official accounts of the war for decades. While some Biafran testimonies are included, the overall narrative structure remains closer to the Nigerian official perspective than to the perspective of those who experienced the war as Biafrans. As a result, key Biafran interpretations of events are marginalized or absent altogether. This is why so many Igbo viewers have reacted critically to the documentary. They recognize their suffering, but they do not recognize their story. In the end, Surviving Biafra succeeds in showing the horrors of war, but it fails to explain why Biafra existed. It fails to fully confront the many massacres of Biafrans. It ignores the importance of the Aburi Accord. It presents the beginning of the war in a misleading way, and it adopts language that reveals its bias. Even the title raises questions. Surviving Biafra suggests that Biafra was the danger from which people needed to survive. But it was Biafrans who had to survive Nigeria. They endured invasion, blockade, starvation, and mass deaths. Many barely survived. Is this not a form of gaslighting? Lastly, the timing of the documentary is also difficult to ignore, coming shortly after General Gowon's renewed efforts to shape public memory of the conflict with the publication of his autobiography, in which the general made so many outlandish claims that had no basis in reality. Whether intentional or not, the documentary ultimately reflects a perspective that is much closer to the British and Nigerian government narrative than to the Biafran one. That is why documentaries like this cannot be the final word. Biafrans, Easterners, and the descendants of those who lived through the conflict must document their own history. Because until they do, the world will hear only one side of the story. And one-sided history is never the whole truth. Thanks for watching.